If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 of you are gathered in my name, I am there among them. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
You may be seated. If I were to ask you, what is at the heart of the Christian gospel, what would you say? Jesus. That would be a good answer, right? If you were to boil down all the teachings, all the writings, all the stories that you find throughout the 4 Gospels into one solitary word that's not Jesus, what would you say? God? How about love? Would you say love? The Gospels can be summed up in love, right? And that's a very good answer. Love seems to be something that Jesus talks about more than anything else. He goes so far as to tell us that the greatest commandment that we can honor is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, with all that you are. You are to love God. And then, the second greatest commandment is as good as the first, which is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So if you were to say love, that would be a very good guess as to how we sum up all of the Gospels. But what if I told you that there is a different word that can sum up the Gospels? What do you think that word might be? Faith? How about forgiveness? Reconciliation? In a sermon that he preached, Archbishop Desmond Tutu suggested that we immediately jump to love being the center of the gospel, because love is something we think that we understand. It's something that we think that we are able to show to one another. And we should actually consider the heart of the gospel is forgiveness, reconciliation. Because you cannot have love for someone, the love that Jesus is talking about. You cannot love someone the way that God wants us to love them without first having forgiveness and reconciliation for one another. Archbishop Tutu goes on to say that forgiveness is not some sentimental namby-pamby thing. It is costly. It cost God the death of God's Son. So what about this? What if we saw the heart of the gospel as a blueprint on how we are to forgive one another, how we are to reconcile with one another so that we can ultimately love one another? God's desire to forgive God's people was so great that God was willing to sacrifice Jesus so that we would know the depth of that forgiveness, the lengths that God is willing to go to reconcile with God's people. I think that is what Jesus is driving at in our gospel lesson today. He's giving his disciples the basic outline on how to deal with conflict, to seek forgiveness and reconciliation. Because Jesus wants us to understand that once we receive that forgiveness and reconciliation, that's ultimately going to lead to our ability to love one another as God has loved us and as Jesus has commanded. But I think you'd agree with me that forgiveness takes work, right? That is often the sticking point for many of us. And when we try to forgive somebody, that we sometimes have to work at it. And so rather than do the work, we just forget about it. We want to forgive one another, but we aren't very good at it. We struggle with forgiveness and reconciling with one another because it's easier to carry that grudge. And forgiveness is a two-way street that we don't like to travel very often. Forgiving someone else means we have to be vulnerable ourselves. And what Jesus proposes in Matthew 18 makes us feel very vulnerable. because it might mean multiple times addressing a situation that would be easier if we simply avoid it. Right? Those things in our lives that cause us problems, it's easier often to just avoid them and let the problem get bigger, or maybe it'll happen to go away. It's easier than it is to stare that fear in the eye and speak the truth as we see it. I like to think of it like it's giving that side hug. That side hug is good. It's giving that hug, but it's not really giving that full-on hug that you get, because giving a full-on hug takes your commitment. It takes vulnerability. But kind of ignoring it doesn't. Forgiving someone else means we have to be vulnerable ourselves. And that is different. That is difficult, and it is hard. Yet when we do that, we are doing what Jesus is asking of us, seeking and offering forgiveness and reconciliation. It is hard work, but it is work that is essential. Some might even say that forgiveness and reconciliation, that's the vocation of the church. That's what we are called to do as siblings of Christ, as children of God, is to reconcile and forgive one another. It is our job and our responsibility to put in that hard work, to put in that commitment, so that we can be a community of believers that cares for and about each other enough to speak the truth and to hear the truth as it's being spoken, without getting defensive or completely shutting each other out. If we say that we want to be a church that is a safe place for people to bring their brokenness, their pain, their vulnerabilities, their doubt, then we have to be serious about doing what it takes to create that safe space where people know that they are accepted as they are and loved for who God has made them to be. And this can be difficult. This can be difficult because it means setting aside our differences and then focusing on that which unites us, which is God's love for us and for all of God's people, regardless of what they might look like, who they might love, what they might do, or anything else that we dream up that helps us to set up those dividing walls. If we truly mean that we want to be a church that welcomes all people, then we have to live that out and not simply say it because it sounds good. You might have seen or heard the phrase, "a place to belong," associated with peace over the past month or so. And it's a phrase that you're going to continue to hear as we move forward this year. This is a theme we want to use as we talk about how we can be church together, how we can be a place that all are in fact welcome, how we can be a place that people can feel safe to be who God has created them to be. Being church together means that we need to engage in some difficult but very rewarding work, knowing that we won't do it perfectly, and that's okay. To know that it's not about doing it perfectly, but rather doing the work that's needed and required of us. We simply need to recognize that God has called us together in this place and wants us to know that no matter what, we are loved. We are loved because God has chosen us. And when we recognize that and acknowledge that, then we can live out those words we heard in Romans. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Church, love one another as you continually practice seeking forgiveness and reconciliation, because you are called together as a family, as a faith community, as church. Together, you are the church, and together, this is a place that we can belong. Let it be true that all are welcome.